And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I really appreciate you being with me. Well, here we are, second week in March 2024. Hope your week is going well. Hope your month is going well. Hope your year is going well. All right. And thank you again so very much for being with me. By the way, I'll take just a moment here. You can see over my shoulder here this hand axe right here. Some of you have inquired about that. And as many of you know, I absolutely love knives. I love sharp things. But I was privileged to be with the group called Burroughs of Berea and in Asheville, North Carolina, and had a fantastic time there. And Rick Welch owns a company that manufactures these hand axes. Now, I would get it down and show it to you a whole lot closer, but I'm afraid I'd cut myself. Listen, this hand axe is a work of art. And as I said, I love handcrafted. I love well-crafted. I love beautiful workmanship. And this hand axe is it's really amazing. And so it was, to use the term, it was my honorarium for being out there, and I was just perfectly cool with that. Because you don't find this quality of a hand axe hardly at all. And you have to pay some pretty serious money for something that is utilitarian as this, something that is high crafted and quality as this. It's one of my cherished pieces, I'll tell you that. And just recently had a good friend send me several handcrafted knives, and I'll be putting up a display box on my wall behind my office or behind my desk in my office there, so that many of you can see those as well. The knives are just absolutely beautiful, and so I'm extremely blessed. I've got some folks of you out there who know of my hobby, know of my collectors, and I collect cars too. So if you want to send me a Shelby GT500, I'm cool with that. Sorry, had to do that. But anyway, this smaller hobby of knives, and you can't see hardly any of my other knives behind me except just a tiny bit of this one. Okay, but you can't really tell much about it. But anyway, right over here, I've got two other knives that are beautiful. And like I said, what I started to say, I've got some folks that are my regular viewers, and that every once in a while they'll send me a nice knife. And boy, I love that. And that's not a solicitation, I'm telling you. But nonetheless, I just genuinely, absolutely appreciate that when someone is thoughtful enough and they're able to do that, to send me a good quality knife. Because my mantle place over my fireplace at my house got all sorts of knives on it. My bookshelf behind my desk at the house has knives on it, and I've got all sorts of knives in there. Everywhere you look in my offices, I have knives, because, like I said, I just appreciate the workmanship. I've never been able. I don't know anything about building them except I've watched programs, and the craftsmanship, the work that goes into creating a hand-forged, hand-built knife, to me, is just absolutely astounding. And I appreciate that kind of quality. Okay, that was an unpaid commercial for Rick Welch of Burroughs of Berea, and the quality of workmanship that they produce out there, and an appreciation for my good friend who sent me, and I'll tell you more about that later, the several knives just recently. Okay, so I want to get back to our study of the challenge of Christ. I've shared with you that there are some folks who absolutely cannot stand the idea that Jesus' challenge is applicable even today. They absolutely cannot stand the idea that the challenge of Christ applied to his predictions of his coming, the judgment, and the resurrection. Because they know that if that challenge of Christ in John chapter 10:37 is valid and effective and binding and applicable today, that means that their eschatology goes up in smoke. It melts into the ground, to use another analogy. So what was the challenge of Christ? Those of you who have been following my program now for well over 2 years, you know that Jesus said, "Do not believe me for my words' sake. Believe me for my works. If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me." Now, supposedly, according to these skeptics, these scoffers, the only thing that applied to was his resurrection. In other words, the challenge of Christ is only valid in regard to Jesus' prediction that he was going to go to Jerusalem, be betrayed, be crucified, buried, but on the third day rise again. Has nothing to do, pardon me, with any of his other works. Has nothing to do with his eschatological predictions. Now, you can look and look and look and look at John chapter 10, and you will not find that restriction. So those who object to my appeal to John chapter 10 verse 37 are creating a restriction for the definition of the challenge of Christ that is simply not in the text. But let me reiterate this point. The only reason that they try to exclude Jesus' eschatological predictions from his challenge is because they believe that Jesus did not come back in the first century as he predicted he would. They know and they believe that the judgment of all men, as predicted in Matthew 16:27. And according to their view of that event, judgment of the globe, did not happen in the first century, in the lifetime of the people to whom he made the prediction and the promise. They know that their concept of the resurrection, physical bodies coming out of the holes in the ground, they know that didn't happen in the first century. Within a very short time frame, for instance, of 1 Peter chapter 4, that states that Christ was, quote, ready to judge the living and the dead, unquote. And the Greek word translated as ready is hitoimos, meaning not only morally prepared, but temporally imminent, about to judge the living and the dead. Hey, folks, that's the resurrection. But these scoffers, those who attack, and by the way, here's something really interesting. They post their attacks of what we are saying on a Facebook forum that I left long ago because of the blatant dishonesty of the leading members of that forum. So they know that I don't see their videos. Okay? Doesn't matter. Simply doesn't matter. Point of fact is, ladies and gentlemen, back to John chapter 10, verse 37. There was no restriction in Jesus' words when he said, "Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works." I mean, after all, it is plural, works, not just work, of his personal resurrection. So works is something broader, more inclusive than just his physical resurrection. But again, these folks can't have that. Because if Jesus was saying, in effect, if I don't come in judgment the second time for the resurrection, then don't believe me. But you see, I've been sharing with you that Jesus' words were in fact inclusive of his eschatological predictions. And what we've been doing over the last several months is taking a deep dive into Daniel chapter 9, 24 through 27. In that passage, Daniel the Daniel the prophet was told 70 weeks are determined upon your holy people, upon your city, holy city, and upon your people. Now, we started last week an examination of this singular tenet to bring in everlasting righteousness. You know, pardon me, this promise, as given to Daniel, must have resonated incredibly with Daniel. Now, why is that? Because earlier in the chapter of Daniel chapter 9, as it is divided for us, Daniel looked back at the prophecies or prophecy of Jeremiah, found in chapter 27 and chapter 29, that said Judah and Jerusalem was going to go off into Babylonian captivity, and they were going to be there for 70 years. Well, Daniel did the calculations, and he knew that the time was near. The time had come. Now, by the way, for all those skeptics who say, well, God can't tell time, I wonder then what God meant by that prophecy when he said Jerusalem, that Judah would be in bondage for 70 years. Do you reckon God knew what 70 years was? If God can't tell time, and if God doesn't tell time like we do, then it's rather facetious and it's rather untenable, is it not, to say, well, Jeremiah, through the word of the Lord, said Judah would be in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. Did God mean 70 years? Well, of course he did. And the fact that God used 70 years, prosaically, literally, is proof positive that God can tell time perfectly well. And he's always communicated in time truthfully. He has never been so completely ambiguous about time so that he could say something was at hand and yet hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years were involved. That is, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, for being so blunt, that is utterly ridiculous. I got to move on. So here is Daniel. He realizes that the time of the captivity is about up. And Daniel utters what is known as a Reb Todeh prayer. Now, a Reb Todeh prayer has about 5 constituent elements to it in the Hebraic worldview. And it involves, number 1, expressing the holiness and acknowledging the holiness and the righteousness of God. Number 2, acknowledging the judgment under which Daniel and his people were living, i.e., the Babylonian captivity. Number 3, speaking of the holiness of God, the justice of God, the righteousness of God in bringing that punishment, that captivity on them. And then, for brevity's sake here, asking for forgiveness, and number 5, asking that God remember his covenant with Israel, which said, if you sin, I'll send you off into captivity. But there in captivity, if you remember my words and if you repent of your sin, you confess your sin and you confess it, repent of it, then I'll bring you out of captivity. That's what a Reb Todeh prayer was. All right? Pardon me. Allergies here in southern Oklahoma are just raging right now. And you can tell it right there. Okay. So what does Daniel do? How does that fit into what we're talking about the promise of the coming of everlasting righteousness? Well, he starts out by admitting and acknowledging and praising and extolling the righteousness and the holiness of God. Number two, he acknowledges Israel's sin. And he said they had violated God's covenant with them. And as a direct result of that violation of Torah, they were now in captivity. But here's the point I want to get at, the point I want to focus on. Daniel is acknowledging their unrighteousness. He acknowledges they violated the law. And so, in confessing Israel's unrighteousness, in confessing their violation of the law, and in consequence of praying to Yahweh to remember his covenant with them and to restore them in fulfillment of his covenant promises to them, the archangel is sent. And they are told, he is told, Daniel, unrighteousness is the problem here. The inability, the unwillingness, the inability to be righteous. And so God said, 70 weeks are determined to bring in everlasting righteousness. As I began to say a moment ago, ladies and gentlemen, this must have resonated incredibly with Daniel, because he realizes that Israel, living under Torah, had no ability to achieve unto righteousness. Centuries before, Isaiah had said in Isaiah chapter 26, Lord, we have been in pain. We have been as a woman in travail. We have striven to bring forth what? Righteousness, salvation. But all that we have brought forth is wind and futility. So Isaiah was describing life under Torah. Now, was Torah itself bad? No. But Torah had a very, very distinctive purpose, ladies and gentlemen. And I hope you'll watch my YouTube videos that I'm currently making on the feast days of Israel. And specifically at this particular point, we're examining the Sabbaths, plural. But we're starting with the Sabbath day, the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, why am I doing this? Why am I bringing this up? Because as I've been examining the fact that the Sabbath day, the seventh-day Sabbath day, was a feast unto the Lord, a feast of the Lord, a large number of Sabbatarians, that is, those who worship on the seventh-day Sabbath and believe that is God's day of worship, not Sunday, have challenged me. Most of them have been very, very nice about that, and I appreciate that. That's the way to engage in dialogue. But they've been trying to say, well, the seventh-day Sabbath was distinctive. It's more important than any of the other Sabbath days. Now, they haven't produced any proof of that. But here's a point that I have made, a point that I will continue to make. God gave Israel the Sabbath day as a covenant sign between himself and Israel, a distinctive covenant sign that he did not give to any other nation. And here's a point that I want to get to. as righteous and holy as the law itself was, as good and as spiritual as it was. Those who try to impose Torah on people today, and there is an extremely large number of folks who call themselves Christians, and they are, quote, Torah observant Christians. They fail to see, ladies and gentlemen, please catch the power of this. The law was given, point number one, to lead to Christ. And Paul said in Galatians chapter 3 that they, the Jews, were under the law as a schoolmaster until the seed, that's Christ, should come to whom the promises were made. Under the law until the coming of Messiah. After Messiah, no longer under the law. Why? Well, because the law was the schoolmaster to lead to Christ. Christ has come. We no longer need the schoolmaster to lead us to him. Now, does that mean the Old Testament is worthless? No. Paul said in Romans chapter 15, verse 4, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Paul, as a minister of the gospel, drew his eschatology from Torah, from the Old Testament. Does that mean that once that eschatology was fulfilled, that we cannot go back to the Old Testament and see how the Old Testament feasts, for instance, including the Sabbath, were shadows of the good things that were about to come and that did come in the first century? No, it opens up our minds and it shows us the beauty and the glory and the power of God who fulfilled the typology, the shadow form of those Old Covenant feasts. So the fact that the law has passed as a binding covenant set of legal mandates does not negate the power and the beauty and the beneficial use of that old law, not to bind things on us today, but to learn how God dealt with people, his people in the past. But there's a second element here, ladies and gentlemen, and this goes directly into the issue of everlasting righteousness. And that is that Torah could not bring everlasting righteousness. Paul said in Galatians chapter 3, please catch the power of this, 20 and 21, if a law could have been given that could give righteousness, that could bring life, then verily righteousness would have been through the law. Do you catch what Paul's saying? Now, mind you, Paul loved the Old Testament. Paul loved Torah. He loved the Decalogue. He loved God's covenant with Israel. But he said if a law could have been given that could give life, then surely righteousness, you see, righteousness brings life. You see that connection? Life and righteousness go hand in hand. A person who is righteous is walking in life. But Paul's emphatic. Torah, the Old Testament, I'm using the word Torah as all-inclusive here, could not bring righteousness, could not endue or impart or impute righteousness. That's why Paul would say in Romans chapter 5 and verse 21, and he talks about in verse 13 and following, he talks about the fact, a critical fact, death reigned from Adam until Moses. Now I think you'd agree with me, death didn't end at Moses, did it? No kind of death ended at Moses. What sin reigned from Adam to Moses? The death of Adam. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so then death passed upon all men, because all men sinned. Romans 5:12. That's the death of Adam. Well, guess what? Spiritual death, alienation from God, did not end at Moses either. Why? Because God gave the law. Listen very carefully. The law entered that sin might abound. Now, wait a minute, Paul, what are you talking about here? Are you saying that God gave the law to make men sin more and more? No. God gave the law to make man more acutely aware of sin, more acutely aware of unrighteousness, and thus make man more acutely aware of his need for righteousness, his need for God's grace. You see, Paul said in Romans chapter 7, I was alive once without the law. The commandment came. What commandment? Thou shalt not covet. What law was that? I don't have to tell you what law that was. Pardon me. That was the Decalogue. So Paul says, I was alive once without the law. The commandment came. I sinned, or sin revived. I died. Now, I think you're going to agree with me. Paul did not die physically when he sinned, when he violated Torah. That identifies the nature of the death and the purpose of the law. And we'll pick this up next week.